Hi guys! Welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new legal advice content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first one is titled, Houseguest had a deadbolt installed after being reminded that he'll have to leave soon. Questions about the situation in general but specifically the locksmith's liability here. NY State. To be clear, this is not New York City. A childhood friend of my wife's, call him Pete, moved back to the area after the death of a parent and losing his job. We offered to let him crash in our spare bedroom for a month or so while he gets things figured out. Pete moved in on March 28th. And we had him sign something that said that he'd split on June 30th whether he had his crap sorted or not. This was partially to put a hard limit on the amount of time he'd be living with us, but primarily because my brother is going to spend about 6 weeks in town for work starting in mid-July and will be staying with us. Pete didn't seem to be in much of a rush to find a new job, let alone find his own place, but he's in a bit of a funk due to the whole situation, so we'd been giving him the benefit of the doubt. On January 6th, my wife reminded Pete of the fact that he had to go at the end of the month. He said not to worry and that he'd definitely have something figured out by then. She gave him the same reminder this Wednesday, December 6th, I'll spare you the details, but this time Pete countered by confessing that he'd always been in love with her, and that she should leave me and I could find a new place while they stay in the apartment. Which is sort of funny because while I consider this to be her apartment as much as mine, I purchased it before we met and her name isn't on anything. Anyway, she obviously shut this down immediately, and Pete did not respond well. At all. No violence but a ton of shouting, insulting and attempting to guilt trip. It was intense enough that my wife just cut out to her mother's place, where she called me to fill me in on the situation. I went home from work and told Pete that we'd stick to the agreement despite his behavior, but the sooner he was out, the better. I spoke to my wife later that evening and we decided till Pete ducks off, she'll stay in an investment property of mine that is luckily vacant right now, but I'd start working remotely and stay at the apartment more or less 24/7, both to make sure Pete doesn't do anything stupid and because my presence in the living room would hopefully be more than a little awkward for him. So, this morning around 6 o'clock I left to run to the office to grab some stuff I'll need while working from home. I got back to the apartment about half an hour ago, and as I stepped out of the elevator, I saw a guy with a toolbox leaving my apartment and immediately noticed that a new deadbolt had been installed in the door. I tried to explain the situation to the locksmith, but he basically told me that the lock's already in and he gave the only key to the guy in the apartment, so it's between the two of us now. Lovely. I asked him for a card, and he said he didn't have any, so I asked where he works. He told me that it isn't any of my business and reiterated that this is between me and Pete. I followed him downstairs and luckily, he was in a van that had a sticker with the company's name and info on the side. I called the number, asked to speak to the boss and told him what had happened. He more or less did his best to not answer any of my questions. I'm sorry but I don't have to inform you of our policies. Fun. So, this is where I am at now. I called the police just to get a report filed, but I am 100% sure that when the officers show up, they're going to tell me that it's a civil issue. I'm not expecting them anytime soon, as this is a pretty small potatoes deal in the city where the whole thing is taking place. I was actually all set to offer Pete a cash for keys deal if he wasn't getting his crap in gear by June 23rd, but I have a feeling that I am going to have to evict now. I own a few investment properties and have gone through the eviction process before, so I know that will not be a fun process given how tenant-friendly my state is, but it is what it is. We've got that vacant rental property to stay in while everything gets sorted out, so that's covered as well. My only questions now are about who I can go after for what. On that note, here are my questions. I am going to lose money on the rental that my wife and I will be staying in while the eviction gets handled. In fact, I've already done so, as I had just started advertising it and will now have to pull the listing on a few sites / drop a sorry but on anyone who responds to print ads I placed. Is this something I can sue for? In my mind I'd name both Pete and the locksmith company in a suit and let the judge decide who owes me what, but since I am making the decision for us to occupy the space, do I technically have damages? When I got a deadbolt installed at my old rental, I had to show the locksmith a copy of my lease before they'd even touch the door. Was that just a company policy they were following or is that mandated by law? If the latter, is there anything I can go after them for? I don't care if it's trying to get criminal charges pressed or just going the civil route. I am not hurting for money, so frankly if I were to sue it would be more about taking the pound of flesh that I feel I am entitled to after they locked me out of my own home. But I'd be just as happy seeing the pound of flesh extracted in a manner that does not end with me in possession of it. Anything else that I should be thinking about in this situation? I am planning on asking the police to do a civil standby or whatever it's called so I can get a few important things out of the apartment. I am a little flustered and pissed off right now to say the least, so I just want to make sure that there isn't anything I should be considering beyond that. Thanks in advance, and the cops are actually pulling up now, so I might have an update shortly. Edit 1. Just heard from the owner of the locksmith, who sounded about as upset as I am. He's sending a guy over with a new deadbolt and a few extra keys. Apparently, he's already arranged for his dude to show up with some cops in case Pete is not a fan of the lock being changed. Bonus. In explaining that part to me, I got to hear somebody say, "I know a guy who knows a guy," in real life, and now I want to hang out with this dude. Edit 2. Mill took the wife out to get her mind off of this stuff, but she is now being returned to me, so I am gonna stop staring at the internet. The locksmith will be here around 8 p.m. and Pete's brother is going to swing through around the same time to see if he can talk some sense into him. Thanks for all of the advice and well wishes. I'll try to update again tonight if anything interesting happens, but at this point it will more likely be tomorrow. Update. So, I got a call while I was getting ready to head back to the apartment to meet the locksmith. It was Pete's brother. Apologies for the lack of details here, but I don't know too much about exactly what went down, and a chunk of what I do know is sort of personal shit that the brother, who just did me an enormous favor, probably wouldn't want me sharing. Anyway, the gist of the phone call was that he went by and performed a third-party constructive eviction with the back of his hand. So, Pete's gone, as is most of his stuff. His brother is going to swing by next week to grab any odds and ends that they may have missed. I am planning on making him dinner and hitting him off with a bottle of good whiskey when he does so. As far as Pete goes, I'm thinking that I'll follow through with at least the early part of the eviction process just in case he tries anything cute. Gonna speak to my attorney about this first, but he's still in the wind. Turns out he's staying at a cabin his girlfriend's family owns, and it's pretty much as close to being in the middle of nowhere as human-built structures get. His admin, paralegal. I dunno what she is specifically, but she said that yesterday was the one day he wasn't going into town for cell service. This gives us the opportunity to convince him that the situation is currently way worse than it ever was. And as much as I love this guy, he's really fun to duck with, so that's cool. After speaking with him, I called the owner of the locksmith to let him know that the apartment was vacant, so his guy wouldn't need to show up with police. Turns out he was planning on coming by to handle this himself anyway, so that was easy enough. I met him over there. He had a handful of deadbolts for me to choose from, and he switched out the lock in about 5 minutes. We got to bullshitting about baseball because that's what you do in New York, and this led to him accepting my offer to buy him a beer so we could watch the White Sox smack our Yankees around. I got some backstory at the bar, and while this is secondhand information, the dude seems pretty reliable, so I've got no reason not to believe him. The guy who came over yesterday morning was indeed an employee of his, but he wasn't on the clock and actually borrowed the deadbolt without mentioning anything. Turns out he is an old friend of Pete's and had been fed a story about an insane landlord who had decided to move into the apartment Pete was renting. Brilliant. Anyway, my new locksmith buddy told me that this guy was officially unemployed as of that afternoon. I'd feel bad for the dude, but I'm too busy not caring about what his motivation was due to the complete and total lack of any attempt to verify the story he'd been fed. This also explains the non-answers I got when I called the shop. The person I spoke to was a manager who had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. He was basically trying to buy some time to speak with the owner and the guy who installed the deadbolt instead of just pulling an excuse out of his butt for me. I wish he'd told me that in the first place, but I do appreciate the fact that he didn't just try to go into CYA mode for the company, his now former coworker. All in all, I have a new preferred locksmith for when I need something done at any of my properties. So really the only legal shit left is the restraining order, and Pete very kindly sent my wife a few emails last night upon figuring out that she'd blocked his number. Not gonna go into detail, but I'll just say that the contents should make the restraining order easy to get. So, thank for all of the help and well wishes, but it seems like this is more or less a wrap, and a pretty amusing one too. My wife's gone from upset about the whole thing to uncharacteristically indignant, which she's admitted is kind of cathartic for her, so I don't even have a reason to feel guilty about laughing about what a moron Pete is. The next one is titled, Landlord Evicting Me for Staying Somewhere Else After Roofers Dropped an AC Through My Roof. This post is on behalf of my sister, who finds herself going through a rough time right now. I live in a sober living complex in Salt Lake City, Utah. This has been where I have lived for the past 2 years while going through drug court and remaining sober. I do not know if this being a sober living community has any bearing on the legality of the situation, but it is an apartment building with about 20 units. During the beginning of COVID, we were asked to self-isolate, not have any guests, and refrain from traveling. We never signed any sort of addendum about this. It is not in the lease. 4 days ago, a construction crew dropped an air conditioning unit through the roof into my apartment, leaving a gaping hole in the roof. I decided to spend 2 nights elsewhere while they figured out how to repair the roof. My landlord discovered this after they let themselves into my apartment, which is fine. This constitutes an emergency, and confronted me about my absence on day 3 after the roof situation. My landlord stated that because I had decided to stay somewhere else, I had broken the rules and had to leave immediately. I returned to my apartment, where they escorted me upstairs. They had already changed the locks, gave me black garbage bags, and forced me to grab as many things as I could, and then I was escorted off the property. Some of my items are still in the apartment, such as clothes, shoes, pictures, food, etc. My daughter's belongings are also still in the apartment. I could find nowhere to stay that night, and so I slept in a U-Haul truck last night while my daughter slept at a friend. My locks are still changed, and I am unable to enter the apartment. It's important to note that I was not served any type of notice to vacate. I was told to call my landlord on day 3 after the roof was damaged, where they told me I had to come back immediately, pack my things, and leave. This was all over the phone. Questions. 1. Because this is a sober living facility, do they have any special ability to evict someone for not self-isolating due to COVID? I'm current on rent and have not broken my lease agreement. 2. Do they still have to follow standard eviction process of serving notice, then filing in court? 3. Can I get the police to let me back into my apartment, and is this considered an illegal eviction? 4. Does Utah still have a stay on evictions right now? Update. Thank you for all of your advice and well wishes. Not too much attention, but it was enough to reaffirm my suspicions that this wasn't legal for the landlord to do. We were able to get her in touch with a few attorneys, one of which has offered to take on her case pro bono, which was an immense help and relief after the shenanigans we experienced with her first night homeless. She unfortunately hasn't been able to get back in her apartment and we have to try and find accommodations for her, which is proving challenging, but it's a step in the right direction. Again, thank you for your help, and to anyone else that may find themselves wrongfully evicted for not adhering to community quarantine guidelines. Be sure to hold your scumbag landlords accountable for their actions, for the benefit of whoever comes after you. The last one is titled, Landlord Charging Us Tenants for False Alarm Fire Department Response. Pennsylvania. On Tuesday, I was cooking. I was in the kitchen 100% of the time while cooking. It got a little smoky and the fire alarm went off. I shut it off but, unbeknownst to me, the fire department is automatically called no matter what. They show up, I explain what happened. Next day, I find a bill from the rental agency for $500 claiming tenant negligence resulting in fire department being called. I have looked through the entire lease and nowhere does it state that the fire alarms are made to automatically dispatch emergency services. They want the money in 5 days. Should I contest it? Update. We consulted a lawyer. This was after our renter's insurance settled the fee. There was no damage to the unit whatsoever. The lawyer sent a demand letter saying that the $1,000 should be returned to the insurance or used towards rent. No response. She sent a second letter saying we would be putting our rent for this month into an escrow account. So far, no response. I imagine the next step is small claims court. I went and spoke with the fire department, and they said, the bill is the most ridiculous thing I've seen in 25 years. The lawyer says that landlords can't charge for inconvenience. I just can't believe that a large rental company can be so shady. I'm worried that this could blow up in a bad way. While the attorney said she didn't find anything in the lease that suggested this fine was allowed, I wonder what advice you have about escrow or landlord/tenant issues. The main worry I have is that all the advice I seem to find says that holding rent in escrow is only legal in cases of repairs. Thanks for listening.